Alright, what is poppin', people? We are back, and we're gonna be doing another one of those very fabled, very, frankly, quite popular from what I've seen, spotlight videos. And, look, because we got a suspect test going on, I figure now is as best time as any to cover Sigilyph. A Pokemon that some people are a little bit confused as to why it got suspect tested. I've seen a fair bit of debate within like the NU Discord, and I think even just the NU chat room as a whole, as to why we chose Sigilyph over Pokemon like, say, Beware, Mienshao, Pangoro. You know, the big fighting types that you see in the tier that are, at times, quite difficult to handle defensively. And so, this video's gonna hope to provide some insight as to why Sigilyph was chosen, what it does, how you can, like, deal with it, but also because, look, I'm biased towards banning Sigilyph. I think I've made it clear that I am one of the, pro-ban Sigilyph users, so I will try to contextualize why I feel, despite this, frankly, pretty extensive pool of answers to Sigil, why I still view that it's too much for the tier and that we need to get rid of it. As always, if you're enjoying the content, please like the video and please subscribe. We're looking to hit 1,000 subs by the end of the year, and without your help, well, that just won't happen. So please, help a brother out. Alright, so let's get into this. Now, when talking about Sigilyph, I think there are two primary sets that you need to care about. Life Orb and Flame Orb. And you've also got to deal with, like, Tinted Lens Sigil as just that fringe, not super common set, but still just, like, it exists, and it is a very, like, potent breaker within its own right. For those that don't know, Tinted Lens, what it does is it gives you essentially double the damage output when you hit a resistant target. And what that means is, if something is only, resisting your attack one time over, so like Air Slash versus a Copperajah, for instance, is going to be doing neutral damage. And, if something would normally quad resist it, so like Air Slash versus a Togedemaru, it's going to be doing half damage instead of only a quarter damage. Now, you'll notice with these two sets, I don't have the moves filled in, but with this I've got the set filled out. As because Sigilyph has a lot of coverage that it can choose from, and then with respect to the Life Orb set in particular, it's got just a lot of options in general. One of the main selling points to Sigilyph as a whole is its insane moveset versatility. I mean, you look at this list, and while some of these options are undoubtedly memes, I mean, Psycho Cut, I don't know why that's here, Steel Wing, you got a lot of bad options. Yes, but even down here, there are, like, some okay moves. Like Cosmic Power, definitely something we could talk about. But Sigilyph has a lot of leeway around how it picks its checks and counters, between both sets and within the sets themselves. So, when I say between sets, I mean, like, counterplay to these two sets, there's some overlap, but it's also changed. Like, there are some options that just answered this set better than this set, for instance. And when I talk about within sets, you can tech Life Orb Sigilyph, for instance, to be better off versus some of the checks and counters that you saw at the beginning of the video. And another thing that, at this point it's kind of pointless to mention because we've been in this generation for well over a year now, but something that has 1000% benefited Sigilyph is, with respect to generational shifts, Pursuit being gone. The removal of Pursuit is huge. In Gen 7, one of the ways you deal with Sigilyph, right, is through offensively pressuring it. What you're trying to do is hard switch your Sneasels in as the Sigilyph comes in, or get them in on a U-turn, or switch it into a Roost, or a Psychic, or a Calm Mind, or what have you. And from there, you put the Sigilyph user into this, unfavorable 50-50, where you stay in, you risk getting knocked by a CB Sneasel and fainting, or you switch out, you get Pursuit trapped. And even other dark types like Absol were still good at doing this. But without Pursuit, these Pokemon, especially at this point in the metagame, just aren't present. They're not relevant really anymore. And I've talked up Sneasel still as like a fine option. I didn't include it here just because I want to keep it to more meta-relevant Pokemon. I say there's a Lycanroc here. Look, I like Lycanroc still. But the Removal Pursuit meets a Sigilyph, and we've seen this earlier in the generation too with Haunter. These Pokemon that are frail, fast wall breakers that you used to be able to punish for just, switching in haphazardly to try to wall break, no longer have to worry about that. You can still keep up offensive pressure versus a Sigilyph, obviously, with options like, say, Heliolisk, Lycanroc, Aerodactyl, any fast wall breaker that threatens an Oko. That's very possible still. The problem ends up being that you're not threatening to just remove Sigilyph on the spot anymore with some of these. There's no worry about a CB Aerodactyl switching into your Air Slash and then, Stone Edging you if you stay in, or Pursuit Trapping you to switch out. It doesn't matter. You're safe to switch out. And so that's complicated counterplay versus Sigilyph, because this is an issue with Regenerator Mienshao too that people have raised. How the hell do you pin down a Sigilyph and actually remove it? It's so much harder to do that this gen, because it can just stay out of harm's way a lot more reliably. And so when we talk about Life Orb Sigilyph, I think there are two main variations to this. The first one is going to be Calm Mind, right? Wherein you're going to see like these moves. There's not really a singular move other than like Heat Wave that I would say is on every Life Orb Sigilyph. Even Roost can be dropped. But this is one of the more annoying variants, I would say, of Life Orb Sigil to deal with. Because once it starts boosting, even some special attackers like Heliolisk, a lot of people still run boots on Heliolisk. I think it's pretty poor. But this Pokemon can boost up and become really problematic to take out. And because of the prevalence of bulky water types like, say, Gastrodon, potentially Vaporeon if people want to use that as a Milotic substitute, and just other Pokemon as well that don't really threaten Sigilyph, like Defog Flygon, obviously Mantine as well, it's not very hard for Sigilyph, despite how frail it is, to find all these opportunities to set up. And once you start boosting, yeah, Psyshock and Heat Wave is very good coverage. The only Pokemon that I can think of off the top of my head that resists this combination of moves that's, what I would call viable is Guzzlord. It's why Guzzlord's very common, right? Or not very common, but why Guzzlord sees some usage. In general, it's a pretty consistent Sigilyph answer. But why do I say in general? Well, let's start talking about how Sigilyph can vary itself. So, this is probably the second most common iteration of Sigil. Psychic can also be dropped for Air Slash. It's essentially you have one of your stab attacks here, and an E-Ball Heat Wave Roost. Energy Ball and Heat Wave are just generally the best coverage, because Heat Wave hits your Steel types, Energy Ball hits your Dark types, or not your Dark types, my bad, your Rock types, and some like other generic special walls like Milotic at times when we had it, Slowking if you want to look at last gen, Gastrodon if you want to look at this gen. And then you want to stab attack because you want to be able to hit like, fighting types, because Sigilyph's a pretty decent offensive check to things like Beware and Pangoro. But there's room to adapt beyond this. I would say Energy Ball is the most droppable. When you look at rock types in Inu, frankly, a lot of them aren't that common. And it's not to say they're bad, but like Aerodactyl, not as good of a Pokemon as it once was. Diancie, at times hard to justify just because of how good the Steel types are. Frankly, you could still get away with AV Raj plus Diancie, but you get the idea. And Tyrantrum, I would also think most people could agree, has seen better days. But so what's a great way to adapt to some of the dark types that exist? I mean, here's where Sigilyph's great coverage comes into play. You can just run moves like Dazzling Gleam. At the end of the day, this kind of coverage is still incredibly good. You're not missing out on that much, and if you, really want to retain a strong neutral hit, you just flex this back to Psychic, and now you have Dazzling Gleam, and you can still threaten an Oko on Pangoro. You don't need Air Slash to do that anymore. And of course, Psychic still hits Beware. Maybe you want to tech against choice item users like Scarf Tyrantrum, Scarf Mienshao, CB Aerodactyl. You can get away with Protect. It's very possible to still run this kind of configuration. Now, obviously, it's a little less consistent. No Roost is a little bit Monka-S. Because Roost is really helpful. They'll let you continuously switch into the bulky water types, so just general passive Pokemon that give you a lot of opportunities to wall break. And while Roost is nice to make sure that you can get back up to full and it continue to do that throughout the game and essentially blank them as a team slot. But this just gives Sigilyph a lot more safety within games. And even like another option you can see, Defog is an okay it's definitely one of the worst fillers. Like, I'll be just straight up right here. I don't ever run Defog myself unless it is truly that hard to fit it somewhere else on the team. But again, the point is, it's an option. This Life Orb Sigilyph has a lot that it can do that will still be incredibly consistent within games, or at least still allow it to function near or at its peak. And now we're gonna get to this just abomination of a set. I always have issues trying to acknowledge this as a real set and not some shitty meme, because I still have fever dreams back when Gen 5 was the main tier and I was playing Ryu, and I would queue into this and I just would instantly want to stop playing Pokemon. It's so unfun. So like, when you talk about some of the common Sigilyph checks, I think one of the mons that does need to get mentioned is Copperajah, and Bronzong to an extent as well. Bronzong not as good at threatening Sigil. I don't remember heavy slam damage calcs, but Gyro Ball definitely is 2 at KOing Sigilyph. And AV Copperajah also, you know, beats Sigilyph pretty handily. Well, Psycho Shift, even just Spadef Copperajah beats Sigil. I want to make sure that's very clear. But like, Psycho Shift just turns them from good answers to, you know, setup fodder. You pass the burn over and they are no longer able to answer you defensively. And it's so just annoying queuing into this set, entirely for that reason. Even something like Diancie, if it's not Heal Bell, and, you know, Heal Bell still gets outstalled by Psycho Shift. But Diamond Storm Diancie does not beat Sigilyph once it gets burned. You know, potentially Dark types if they want to switch into you or something. You know, you could burn them. Maybe they make a bad misread. You know, Pangoro is always CB. Maybe a Pangoro for some reason tries to stay in versus you because it thinks it can live the attack you have. You know, maybe it's thinking it's going to chew up an Air Slash because you're unboosted. And so, it's like, oh, they'll switch, so I go for CC. Yeah, no, now you're burned. Have fun, smiley face. It's a very good set at neutralizing defensive Pokemon that resist Air Slash. Like, even like Sigilyph, for instance, right? A mon that Sand augments the special bulk of to an insane degree. It's not beating you once it's burned. It's just not. It's no longer an answer to you. This is why I would rate this set as actually legitimate this gen, because it invalidates how a lot of the passive Pokemon that we have now, in lieu of Umbreon and Porygon 2 leaving the tier, which were mons that could actually kind of contend with Sigilyph boosting, or just Sigilyph in general, and that didn't care about burns. Now all the passive mons we have that still do defensively answer Sigilyph, they don't contend with a burn well. And so this set's just a great way at neutralizing them and still enabling Sigilyph to just have a presence throughout the game because it's always threatening to win the game. And the cool thing that I think we also need to acknowledge about Flame Orb, and Sigilyph as a whole, is how good about preventing itself from being actually impacted by status it is. Of course, Magic Guard, part of the reason that it beats up on bulky water types so well, you can't poison it, and even if you get a Scald Burn, it's like, wow, this doesn't help. But this set's also nice because, right, Porygon 2, you know, it commonly run Discharge or Thunder Wave to try to paralyze Sigilyph, because at that point at least, okay, it's slower now. Even slower wall breakers like Beware Pangoro, Delmise can take it out now. Well, if it's burned, you can't even paralyze it. So that's thrown out the window. It's just, this set's really good at preventing itself from being hampered by passive play. And, you know, it punishes passive play itself, too. And now we get the Spec Sigilyph. Now, I have not seen this set really run at all this gen. It's really just been these two. But I think it's still worth mentioning this set outside of the context of just other viable Sigilyph options. Look, there's something to say about just pressing your stab moves and not being punished at all. It's essentially the same deal as Life Orb Sigil, but instead of a utility move last, you're just running another attack. And, it's the same deal there. You can run, like, Gleam here if you want to hit Guzzlord harder. Air Slash is hitting Guzz for a lot of damage, mind you, anyway, but Gleam more immediately deals with it. And if you want to get to a point where you can spam Psychic, maybe you want that. There's not really a lot to say that we didn't already cover when we just talked about Tinted Lens and what it does. This is just a very effective wall breaker. It obviously sucks not having Magic Guard, because now you can actually be crippled by status. Now you're taking Stealth Rock damage, which limits your switching opportunities. It's why Life Orb Sigil is just a more consistent breaker, all things considered, but that's not to say that this is a bad option. It exists. There's more contending with other, like, wall breakers as well, I think, like, more Psychic type wall breakers in particular. When I think of Spec Sigilyph, I, immediately think of Starmie, which is faster, has Analytic as well, so it's not like it can't boost its damage output. But it also has, like, really comparable coverage between its dual stabs and in, the Bolt Beam that you get from Ice Beam and Thunderbolt. So, unlike last gen, I do think this set struggles a bit more with being justified its team slot, but it still works. And then when we get to other options, there are two sets / ideas that immediately are coming to mind. So one of them, I was about to put Heavy Duty Boots. I am very unintelligent. One of them is, very cursed. But it's essentially still just defensive Calm Mind, but with stored power. You could also go, if you really wanted, you go Cosmic Power, but I don't think it's worth it because you hit like a wet paper towel that way. But this set's very much like Flame Orb Sigilyph, except you get the snowball potential of stored power. And in general, there's a few ways you could tech this. You can go Sub as well. Sub's a really good way to punish certain passive forms of counterplay as well. Similarly, it lets you scout what your opponent's, like, primary way of dealing with Sigilyph is as well. And that's very helpful. Now, the other, like, other option set thing, and I'll just add another slot here, is Focus Ash Sigil. Now, this isn't common either. It mostly is just making use of how Magic Guard essentially lets you keep your Sash active the entire game. And it's pretty much the same set as Life Orb Sigil. But you'll see a few other moves used last. We'll just put the default coverage here. You can see Thunder Wave more frequently on this kind of set. Also, we're putting the 4 EVs in defense, it doesn't matter. You can see Thunder Wave more frequently on this set. I've even seen Tailwind before. It's essentially just a form of speed control, for all intents and purposes. But the reason on Life Orb that you prefer, generally, moves like Protect and Roost, is that you want this game, that is set, to have more longevity. You want to make sure that it can protect itself, primarily. Whereas with this set, you're more based around supporting your teammates and augmenting their, like, overall presence. But now we get to checks and counters, and I got a few things to say about some of these Pokemon. Now, when I think of checks and counters to Sigil, I think of 3 broad categories. I think of Steel types, I think of Dark types, and I think of Rock types. Now, I do have Pangoro in here. I do want to just clarify here, because we've seen that Sigilyph runs Air Slash fairly frequently. This is entirely for sequences in which Sigilyph does not have Air Slash or Dazzling Gleam, can't burn Pangoro, and it switches in on like a Psychic or a Roost. It's a very shaky check otherwise. But when you talk about Steel types, right, yes, they get cooked by Heat Wave. Yes, they get burned by Psycho Shift. But it's undeniable that they're still a check. Because at the end of the day, these Pokemon prevent Sigilyph from using its stab attacks. Like, Again, Sigilyph only has Heat Wave, so if they're ever on the other team, you have to go for Heat Wave to actually hit them. And they can take advantage of Sigilyph being forced out potentially by them. Bronzong can set up rocks, maybe poison the switch in. Copperage can do the same with setting up rocks, or if it's an Assault Vest set, it can just start wall breaking. You know, something you don't want to forget about Copperage, even when it's running AV, is it's a wall breaker primarily, in my opinion. And then when you get to dark types, right, we've talked about Guzzlord a fair bit, resisting pretty much every common move Sigilyph runs outside of the very niche Dazzling Gleam, and the not uncommon, but not the most common Air Slash. And from there, you know, Guzzlord can just threaten to KO Sigilyph with moves like Knock Off or Dark Pulse. Zoroark, you know, it's very easy to see what it does too. It's just straight up faster than Sigil. And a lot of Zoroark too are running physical sets from what I've seen. I've seen a lot of Swords Dance. And so those don't even care about Sigilyph potentially, you know, somehow surviving a hit after a Calm Mind booster a few. You can just knock Sigil and get rid of it there. With Drapion, you don't like that you're slower because you leave yourself vulnerable to Air Slash flinches or again being burned by Psycho Shift. But you beat up on like the Heat Wave Psyshock Calm Mind Roost variants very well, and you can just knock Sigilyph off and KO it like that. You also just always deal with it effectively if you're Scarf Drapion. And again, we talked about Pangoro. And when we look at rock types, in the last just generally broad category, it's dire because a lot of these Pokemon aren't super common or have ways of being played around as well. Like again, Gigalith and Lycanroc both, like Sand isn't just really used at all in NU anymore. But Gigalith does wall Sigilyph very effectively. Psyshock hurts, being burned sucks. But other than that, you're pretty consistent. Even Energy Ball isn't to do it KO. Lycanroc, you always outspeed and KO. Same with Aerodactyl. And in Diancie, you're pretty much a consistent answer. SpedF Diancie, at least. So long as you avoid the very dreaded Psycho Shift, which otherwise is going to make you waste all your Diamond Storm power points, as it just roosts up in your face. Now, one last just general form of counterplay that I want to mention here is Trick. Now, a Pokemon like Bronzong can very easily run Trick Scarf as well, and I have a team with Trick Scarf Bronzong entirely to try to, you know, bait a Sigilyph into staying in versus me, so I can cripple it. But other Pokemon as well can potentially get that trick off. You know, like you think Rotom Cut potentially. You can get a trick off versus Sigilyph and cripple it like that. Celebi maybe. If it's, you know, willing to drop the item. Espeon as well, although Espeon isn't a very great Pokemon right now. It's obviously a very inconsistent way of dealing with Sigilyph. And it's not reliable. And it doesn't actually remove Sigilyph from the battle there. But it can potentially halt the efforts of Sigil, if that makes sense. And I didn't mention them here, mostly because the most common Sigil sets run Psychic moves. But Electric types as well, like Heliolisk, again, Rotom Cut, they can situationally handle Sigil. Also, I don't know why I did not include it in here. Tyrantrum, Scarfed specific, does not care about Sigilyph's, you know, set. It just head smashes it. You have to hit, but it's still a very reasonable form of counterplay. Yeah, it's gonna be it for the Sigilyph spotlight. I hope that this at least showed why we're testing Sigil over some of the other options. I mean, again, I think really it just comes down to the fact, and I replied to someone else's comment saying that they didn't understand why we didn't go with Mienshao or Pangoro. I really do just think it comes down to the fact that Sigilyph is not a known commodity from preview. And that isn't inherently a problem for a Pokemon, but when it's something as potent as Sigilyph, it becomes much more threatening. Something like a Beware, you know for a fact that it's going to be SD or Choice Band, and counterplay to those sets does not really differ. Both are blowing back your team, regardless. And I mean, like, sure, SD Beware could run Choppleberry. Mienshao doesn't Okoyu though anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Bangoro, 95% of the time it's gonna be CB, and just not really have the most coherent defensive counterplay. I mean, that is just simple as that. Something like Mienshao. Mienshao is a bit different. Scarf Mienshao is not nearly as omnipresent as I would say that like SD Beware or CB Pangoro are. Mienshao, you do see more deviation between Scarf and Life Orb sets. But counterplay doesn't really change. I mean, it's more that like defensive fairy types are now a lot less consistent into it, right? But you still have like defensive poison types are going to answer it consistently no matter what. And that at least helps. Whereas with Sigilyph, I do believe that counterplay is genuinely negatively impacted to the extent to which this set diversity is actually a problem. Having it, you can't really find out how you want to deal with Sigilyph from preview as consistently as you can with other Pokemon. And one wrong prediction, I've said this I think many times before, but one wrong prediction versus Sigil, trying to figure out the set, I think has a lot more negative long-term game impact than it does with some of these other Pokemon. And that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. And again, I also hope that this helped explain the thought processes of TL of tier leadership, both council and the TLs themselves. And I hope you guys just enjoyed the video as well. As always, I hope you guys are enjoying your day, your morning, your afternoon, your whatever that. I don't know what time it is where you live, man, but I hope you're enjoying life. Obviously, Suspect Ladder's up. Get on that if you want to have a say on Sigilyph staying or going. I unfortunately need to ladder for it. I don't know if I'll record my laddering because honestly, I don't want to ladder at all for Suspect Rex. I fucking hate trying to get Rex, bro. It sucks because I want to ladder for fun and I can't when I'm doing it for Rex. But we'll trooper through it. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.